Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. I remember buying my Game Boy Advance when it was first released, along with a copy of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, which was an amazing port of the game. I ended up with way more games for the system than I needed, and I was always impressed with what it could do. Amazingly, there were a number of first-person shooters released for the system, and as you'd expect, the results were a mixed bag. So in this video, we're going to take a look at all the ones I could find that were released to see if they are any good. Now, how about I shut up, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look at some games. First up is 007 Nightfire, a port of the excellent FPS game released for the GameCube, Xbox and PS2. It's your standard Bond story with an evil bastard want to take over the world and get rich. As always, this involves goons, casinos, car chases and lots of shooting. So, yep, it's a first-person shooter, and you control Bond through a number of levels, packed with various objectives that ultimately boil down to shooting people in the face, finding certain items, or making sure you don't die. Graphically, the game isn't great, even on the small screen, though it's not the worst we'll see today. All weapons and enemies are 2D digitized sprites, and the environments are all polygons, pretty much like every game you're going to see here. They are all functional, but incredibly low detail, and everything is very pixelated. It's hard to see what anything is from a distance, and even close up it's pretty hard to make out what the hell is going on. The levels themselves have a fair bit going on in them, and they're split into multiple areas. It can often be hard to know where you're meant to go, and I would usually accidentally walk into doors or windows which turned out to be the exits to the next stage. But usually I would wander around for way longer than I would have liked, and having said that though, the environments are distinct enough that I didn't really get lost, I just didn't know where the hell I was meant to go. Control wise, the game is alright, it's a little slow and quite jerky. The frame rate is pretty damn terrible most of the time, but you can run, jump, crouch and strafe, so it does let you do everything you need, and to be fair, I've played a lot worse. There's a few weapons to use and they're all alright. There is a pretty generous auto-aim which definitely helps. Something that did stand out though were the sound and music, which are actually pretty damn good. Overall, this isn't a particularly good game, but it's also not terrible. I did have a bit of fun with it, but I'm certainly in no rush to play it again. So, of course, stick with the console versions.
This way.
Next up is Backtrack, which I didn't actually know, but it's actually a port of a 1998 PC game, and it's not really a good sign when it's a port of a game that you've never even heard of. But anyway, the story here is that you're out to stop an evil alien race and rescue the 110 captured humans in their strange base spaceship thing. This is really the definition of a corridor shooter, as every level is a series of maze-like narrow corridors packed with enemies like robots and of course aliens. You'll need to explore every inch of the levels, finding keys and rescuing all the hostages on each floor of the base before you get to fight the final boss. What's interesting here is that you get one life for the whole thing, so it's a case of learning the levels and getting a little bit further each time. Now, you can actually save your progress, but if you do die just once, it's back to the start. And you know what? I actually kind of like that. But what I don't like is pretty much everything else. The graphics here are just crap, with incredibly low detail on just about everything. The animation on enemies and your guns is just terrible, and most of the enemies look like they're drawn by children, with goofy, uninspired designs that really don't fit in with the rest of the game. The level design is just bad and awkward most of the time. Thankfully, you have got a map that you can call up at any point to see where you need to go, and it actually does highlight where the hostages you need to rescue are being kept. The weapons are pretty dull, and ammo is surprisingly scarce, meaning you'll often have to resort to your knife to attack, and that is basically just a suicide sentence. There's times where it's actually better to just ignore enemies and try to outrun them. That's if you can in the incredibly cramped, narrow levels that mostly look exactly the same to one another, no matter how far you in the game. But again, thank goodness for that map. The controls are actually kind of good here, to be fair. The game is very choppy and slows down a lot, but it's also kind of smooth, which I know doesn't make any sense, but it will if you're playing it, which you shouldn't. Aiming is still a bit of a pain in the ass, but it's doable, and you do get a decent auto-aim here again. I was actually kind of glad when I stopped playing this one. After an initial bit of fun, it soon just became tedious to play, and it's just really not that much fun at all. Dark Arena was a game that I remember seeing everywhere at the time, being heavily hyped as the best 3D game on the system, partly because it was the only one at the time, as it was the fourth game to be released for the system. And you know what? It's actually fine. The story here is that there's some genetically engineered soldier weapon type freaks, and you'll never guess, but they go out of control, which is very surprising because that never happens in these sort of situations. So it's down to you to go there and shoot everyone in the face, find keys and get to the teleporter on each level. There really isn't much else to the gameplay. It's your classic 90s style shooter, but it actually is pretty fun to play, even if it does just feel like a reskin of Doom. Surprisingly, it does actually run very smoothly and actually looks quite good when you're playing on a small screen. The enemies aren't particularly varied, but they look alright and are fun to fight. The controls are smooth and surprisingly responsive, and I didn't really encounter much in the way of slowdown. I enjoyed the selection of weapons I got to try, with pistols, shotguns, laser rifles and rocket launchers all feeling good to use and having their own place in battles. As with most games like this, the biggest issue for me is the level design, which is often just confusing and hard to navigate. Now you do actually get a map here, but you have to find it in each level and it doesn't gradually fill up as you explore. This is a pain in the ass, as a lot of the levels look very similar thanks to the narrow corridors and repeated textures, and often the map is in a hidden area and not just somewhere for you to come across. Now, none of the levels are particularly large, but as with a few games like this, there is sometimes a heavy reliance on needing to find these secrets that contain the keys you need, and this can mean walking around in every small wall that you see, hoping one of them will open. Just makes you feel like a bit of a twat most of the time. But having said that, I did really enjoy playing this one. You get passwords, so it's easy to pick up where you left off. Also, the fact that it runs so well, especially when compared to the other games that came out much later in the Game Boy life, this is actually pretty impressive. I would recommend checking this one out if you can. As is written in the scriptures of old, Doom got a port to the Game Boy Advance, as it must do for any and every electronical device on the planet. Now, I don't really mind this, as Doom is easily in my top 10 video games of all time, but how is it on the handheld? It's fine. Now, you all know Doom, or at least I hope you do. You're a space marine and you're taking on the forces of hell after they're unleashed on a Mars base. Oh, and they also killed your rabbit, so you need to get revenge for that. And yes, that's all true. You know the drill, you explore levels, find keys, kill bad guys and get to the exit. That's all there is to it. And this is a fine port. Of course it's not a patch on the PC version, but it is better than the SNES version. There have been a few changes. For starters, the levels have been simplified in a few areas, but it's nothing major. The levels are mostly the same, but there's geometry that's been dumbed down or removed completely in areas where it's not really needed. Also, the blood has been changed from red to green as it's Nintendo, and there seem to be fewer enemies in the game, though there's still more than enough. Other than that though, it's mostly all here. As far as I could tell, all the levels are present, which is nice, and they do actually look surprisingly good on the small screen. The same with the enemies. They are very pixely from a distance, but they don't look too bad close up, keeping most of their animations, but sadly they don't explode into chunks in this version. I'm not sure if that's because they'd be too gory, or if it just was they couldn't. The actual gameplay itself is pretty smooth though, for a Game Boy Advance first-person shooter anyway. It's less than 30 frames a second, but does control pretty well and you move kinda quickly and it's easy to aim. The sound and music here though are excellent, and almost all of the tracks from the original are present. If you do need some Doom on the go, this isn't your worst option, though it is probably available on your phone these days, but who knows. Anyway, if you do want some Doom on the go, give this one a try. Not to be left out, Doom 2 also got a port to the Game Boy Advance, and pretty much everything I said about the original applies here. The story, of course, carries on from the original, and after making it back to Earth, you find out that demons have taken over Earth. But that's okay, you've got a shotgun. Again, the levels are large mazes packed with enemies, and you've got to find keys to get to the exit. As before, the game is largely the same here, with slight changes to the levels to accommodate the weaker hardware, as well as a few enemies being different and introduced at different times. For example, the minigunner shows up a few levels later than in the PC version, and is used a lot less frequently. This version of the game actually runs a fair bit smoother than the port of the first one though, which is nice, and although it does still have a fair bit of choppiness and slowdown, it's still fun to play, with little to no control lag. And speaking of controls, they've changed them up slightly, making it easier to change weapons, which is nice. If you're a fan of the first game, then this is a must-have. Personally, I've actually always preferred the first Doom over this one, but you can't really go wrong with either of them, and here on the Game Boy Advance, they are fun games to play. Another classic DOS shooter that got a port to the Game Boy Advance is Duke Nukem Advance. In fact, this actually isn't a port of the DOS game, but instead its own thing, based loosely on the second episode, where Duke is in space. This time round, you're actually given mission objectives that you have to complete before being able to move on to the next level, and your adventure takes you through space and even ancient Egypt. The levels are all relatively large, and they are the usual thing of needing to find keys and whatever object the Colonel bloke wants you to find before you can move on. There's loads of enemies in the levels, and you get Duke's usual array of massive weapons to take them down with. Thankfully, this is a hell of a lot of fun to play. The action here is really smooth and fast, and the controls are spot on and intuitive. I never had any problems killing enemies or navigating the levels, though as you'd expect by now, I did get lost quite a lot. The graphics here are excellent, and it's really impressive just how much they managed to cram in and still keep a steady frame rate. I rarely even noticed any slowdown or choppiness. They've managed to keep most of the enemies here and even introduce a few new ones. Also, as you play, you'll get dialogue boxes pop up that remind you of your objectives and let you know everything you need to know, pushing on the story, which isn't particularly interesting, but it's always nice to have. There is little to no music throughout the game though, and you just have ambient sounds to listen to, and one of the most annoying alarm sounds that goes off every time an enemy spots you, which really is so bad I had to turn off the sound for the first few levels. Whoever thought that was a good idea is an idiot. But stick with the game though, and it's a hell of a lot of fun, and actually one of the best, if not the best, in this video. If you're a fan of Duke, or just first person shooters in general, definitely check this one out. Ecks vs Sever is another game that was majorly hyped up before its release, and it's clearly a franchise they wanted to be a global smash. What do you mean you've never heard of it? The story here is that there are two assassin people, Ecks and Sever, and they both have been hired to do a similar job but by opposing forces, which of course means they run into each other and try to kill each other. I'll leave you to speculate whether they realise they're both working for the bad guys and team up by the end. You're thrown into various missions in exciting real-life locations like warehouses, regular houses, and the streets, where you'll need to kill bad guys, not kill civilians, and fulfill a number of objectives like setting off bombs, hacking into computers, and the such. Now the gameplay here is actually pretty damn good, with some great smooth control that works really well. The levels are relatively open and often packed with enemies who aren't too hard to kill, but they are all hit scanners, so if they see you, it's hard not to take damage. The enemies come in a few varieties, but not really, as you can tell that every enemy is just a reskin of another one, but with a different weapon and hit points. In fact, the enemies don't even drop the same weapon they're holding most of the time. You'll kill a guy that's holding a pistol and he'll drop a shotgun, but you can tell what weapon he is actually going to drop because of the sounds they make when they're trying to shoot you. All the enemies also have exactly the same animations, which do look a bit daft when you kill a few people in one shot with a shotgun blast or grenade, and they all fall down in a synchronized pattern. But hey, it's a kind of cool animation, so I'll get over it. Something I haven't mentioned is that you get to play as either Ecks or Sever, and while they do have the same levels, you play each one from the different character's perspective, so you do actually have different routes to take and objectives to complete, which is a pretty cool thing, and you do come across the other character at certain points where you have to fight or sometimes just try and do a runner. This isn't an easy game though, and even the first few levels put up a hell of a challenge, though it is really fun to play. It's a shame that the settings are all so mundane, as it's hard to get excited about a gunfight in a generic warehouse, but the gameplay controls are decent enough that it's still worth playing. This is definitely one of the better FPS games for the system, and it is recommended. Ecks vs Sever 2 Ballistic, which is actually known as Ballistic Ecks vs Sever 2, is of course the sequel, and while the gameplay is largely the same as the game before, it has had some noticeable improvements and quality of life changes. In terms of story, it's basically the same. You're both hired, sometimes you're friends, sometimes you're not, and you've got to stop evil people from being bastards. You know the drill. Once again, you have a load of objectives for each level, and once again, you can choose to play as either Ecks or Sever. Only this time they have very different levels, which is really cool. Graphically, it's not too much different from the first game, it still looks decent, though they have basically used the same enemy sprites from before and just given them a different colour. Even all the animations are the same, which is a shame, but hey, it works. The levels are quite a bit larger here with more to do, and this time you can even talk to NPCs, where you'll get hints or items from them. Shoot them in the face though, and you'll have to start the level again. As before, the controls here work really well, and it's great fun to play, as everything is very smooth and responsive. While it does tend to feel more of an upgrade or mission add-on pack than an actual sequel, this is still worthwhile playing if you're a fan of the original. Oh, and they actually made a movie based on this game too, starring Antonio Banderas and Lucy Liu. The fact that most of you probably never even heard of either the game or the movie tells you how well that went down. It's actually a shame they didn't set their sights higher and make these games for consoles rather than a handheld. Well, you never know, they might have done much better. But neither of the games are bad, in fact both of them are pretty good, and I'd say they're both worth adding to your collection. If you want to shoot people but not actually kill them, Greg Hastings' Tournament Paintball Maxed might just be the game for you. Except it sucks, so probably not. It is just what it sounds like. It's a paintball game, which on paper there's certainly nothing wrong with the idea. There isn't a story, but there is a tournament mode where you go through increasingly tougher and more numerous opponents in small arenas, attempting to shoot them before they shoot you. Or you can do a single match where you do the same thing. The arenas are all pretty damn small here, with a few bits of cover for you to hide behind and peek out of. Of course the enemies will also do the same, so you have to be on your guard as it's just one shot and you are out. To start with, you only have one-on-one matches, but you'll soon be taking on 3 or 4 men at a time, just like Toby Von Doom on a Friday night. Check out the Secret Levels podcast for more information about that. But other than slightly tougher AI, nothing really changes here. There is a stupid mask overlay, and your gun, even though it's transparent, takes up most of the screen, so it's already hard to see anything. Couple that with some pretty crappy graphics, really choppy gameplay and frame rates that make any sort of precision very hard, and you're just going to get annoyed with the game pretty quickly. Also, the controls are just annoying. The L button shoots, and you have to hold the A button to strafe, duck and stand up, but it's just so stiff, jerky and awkward that your best option is just to run and hope for the best. Something I do like though is that if you get shot, you actually have the chance to dodge it, as a bar comes up on the screen and you have to time your button press correctly. If you do it right, you'll avoid the enemy shot, but every time it happens, it gets harder and faster. Toby. Overall, this is a pretty bad game in just about every way. I actually own the Wii version of this too, but I haven't played that yet, and I don't think I'm going to rush to. Don't bother with this one. Here is Ice 9, a story of espionage where you play as Generic Genericson, a spy who has to do the usual spy stuff to stop a bunch of bastards. To be fair, the story isn't that bad here, it's just very generic. There's a mole in your organisation that threatens everyone there, so you have to track him down and save the day. This involves your usual array of simple spy objectives, from killing to collecting to espionage. The game has a bit of a slow opening with some quite lengthy training levels, and at one point I was actually worried that the whole game was just going to be training focused, but it wasn't, and once you get into the main game, it's actually a lot of fun and plays really well. The levels are pretty large and have a few objectives, which aren't anything particularly exciting, but they do the job, and mostly you just need to shoot everyone you see. It tends to be the case that wherever you are has a locked door, which can only be opened once you've neutralised all the enemies, and sometimes even civilians, in the area. Thankfully, the guns you get are all good to use and feel pretty decent. You've got sniper rifles, as well as the usual array of pistols, other rifles and shotguns. The controls here are really good and smooth, and I never had any problems with getting around, or shooting people in the face or ballsack. The only thing that was a bit annoying is that you have to pause the game and then access the map from the menu there. It takes a while to load everything up and really breaks up the gameplay in a way that you don't want it to. And when you are on the map, it does actually highlight your objective and it shows you where you are, but it doesn't indicate which way you're facing, which still actually makes it really awkward to know exactly where you need to go. But really that's only a small complaint that I have, and overall this game was a lot of fun. The graphics are very good for the system, and the variety in stages is decent. There's a few that are reused more than once though, which is a shame. But the smooth, fast control and relatively simple objectives meant it was never a chore to play, and actually I did enjoy most of my time with this one. This is definitely one I'd recommend, and I'll be honest, with the generic name and crappy box art, I really thought it was going to be rubbish, but it's not. It's pretty good. So there you go. And then there's Medal of Honor Underground. I always see this come up on the worst Game Boy Advance games of all times list, but as you should know by now, I don't tend to trust these over dramatic internet people. However, in this case, I have to say I 100% agree. This really is a terrible game in every way. The graphics here are awful, it's an ugly pixelated mess, and even up close you can't tell what a single thing is meant to be. Enemies are just a blur, and you have to shoot at anything that remotely moves, but often you won't even know there's an enemy there because it just looks so bad and blends into the background. The frame rate is awful, and the game plays incredibly choppy at about 15 frames per second. The controls of course are slow and unresponsive, and it seems that the game knows this as there's an incredibly generous auto-aim. There's frequent graphical glitches, with enemies being visible through walls, things like doors not opening and just vanishing, and little touches like this that just make everything feel so cheap and terrible. I mean, just look at the game. How was it released in this state? I will never know. But then again, it's EA. They aren't exactly known for giving a crap. The only good thing I could say about this game is that the sound and music quality is excellent. Other than that though, this game really is terrible, so as always make sure you play it so you can appreciate yourself just how bad it is and just how good we really have it. Serious Sam Advance is the handheld version of the game known on PCs and consoles for having epic battles with one man against literally hundreds of enemies at once, armed to the teeth with massive screen clearing weapons, and of course even more deadly one-liners. Yeah. So the Game Boy Advance version is a valiant attempt to capture the essence of Serious Sam being set in ancient Egypt, and again the evil Mental has sent his minions to sort out Sam and take over the world, but Sam ain't having that. Thankfully, due to the limitations of the Game Boy Advance, Mental is only able to send 3 or 4 enemies at a time, and all they can do is lazily wander towards Sam while you casually sidestep them and shoot them till they die. Each of the handful of levels needs you to explore to find keys and switches, and quite often kill all the enemies for other doors to open. Also, on every level you get one new weapon, and you're always generously equipped with ammo, which is nice. Most of the enemies from the Big Brother versions of the game return, though it's often hard to tell as the graphics are so bad that they mostly just look like blobs, though having said that, it looks infinitely better than Medal of Honor. The levels all basically look the same, aside from a few layout changes here and there. And as you can probably tell, the game itself doesn't run particularly well, though it's far from the worst in this video. It is choppy and slow. The exact opposite of every other Serious Sam game, which are all fast-paced, smooth rides that are highly praised at release for being able to shove so many enemies in your face without any slowdown or technical errors. Here, the game can barely handle ammo sprites, let alone 2 or 3 enemies. It's almost as if you turn 45-degree angles at times. It's also a very easy, short game, unlike the others. You'll likely beat the whole thing in under 2 hours with little to no challenge. That's if you can be bothered to sit down with it for that long. The first 2 or 3 Serious Sam games are genuinely some of my favourite FPS games, and would probably be in my top 10 FPS game lists. Maybe that's a video I should make at some point. But this game does not do the series justice in any way. I will say that I did actually find myself wanting to keep playing it, I don't know why, as it's really not a good game, but it probably isn't quite as bad as most of the internet will tell you. It's definitely below average, and not one that I'd recommend though, which is a real shame. And finally for today, here is Wolfenstein 3D. It's another port of the classic FPS game where you play as the awesomely named BJ Blazkowicz, who's been captured by Nazis and has to escape their castle, killing everyone he sees, including Hitler, who, it turns out, has been doing some crazy shit and has even created an army of zombies. The port here is a pretty faithful one, but with the downgrades you'd expect from a Game Boy title. The game looks alright, but the basic graphics, they actually work quite well here. There isn't much in the way of animation though, which is true of the original I suppose. The biggest problem with the graphics are that everything looks the same, and couple that with some very confusing maze-like levels, it makes getting around the levels incredibly tedious even very early on. The levels are packed with secrets and rooms everywhere, and it's just so easy to not be able to tell where is a new area or where not to go because you're sure that's where you've already been, only to find out that that was not the case. I spent a long time in most levels just wandering back and forth trying to find a key or pressing on every wall hoping a corridor would open up for me that would contain items or weapons. Of course there is no map here either, so when I did get lost I was just left to my own devices. It's a shame because the actual combat here isn't bad at all. The game is kinda choppy still, but it controls well enough and fighting Nazis is good fun. It's not easy though, and the enemies are always happy to wipe you out in just a few seconds if you aren't careful. You definitely want to take your time when you're fighting here. Ammo is also quite valuable, so don't go gun crazy. You want to make sure every shot counts. Impressively, all 6 chapters are here in full, and they even kept the red blood and all the references to Hitler, which are often removed depending on which version of the game you're playing. Personally, I've never actually been that big a fan of Wolfenstein 3D, mainly because of the annoying level design. When I was a kid, I had played Doom first, and then I got a copy of this after beating it, so even when I played it back in the 90s, I knew that it didn't compare to Doom. If you're a fan of the original, then this is a good version to have on the go, but I actually find this one hard to recommend otherwise, thanks to the crappy, confusing level design and lack of maps. It's definitely not a bad game, just needed a few quality of life improvements in the port, which they really should have added to make it worth playing. Stick with the Doom games, I'd say. So there you go, 12 first-person shooters for the Game Boy Advance. Which one is your favourite? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. On screen now you can see where you can follow us, so why not do so? We've got loads of great content for everyone to enjoy. Now all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.